Ethan stood on the grand balcony, looking out over the sprawling alien city. The sky was painted in hues of blue and violet, with massive spires piercing the heavens. Below him, the marketplace buzzed with life, alien traders selling exotic goods, creatures from far-off worlds being walked on leashes, and the occasional group of soldiers patrolling the streets. It was a magnificent sight, a far cry from the dusty streets of Earth. Ethan was still trying to wrap his mind around the fact that he was standing in the heart of the alien empire, a place so foreign to everything he had known. He was here as a diplomat, a human liaison to the Queen's court. The Queen was the leader of the most powerful empire in the galaxy, and Earth had only recently been introduced to her world. Ethan's mission was clear: build alliances, exchange knowledge, and ensure that Earth wasn't forgotten as the galaxy's political landscape shifted. But nothing had prepared him for the enormity of the task or the sheer alienness of the place. The Queen's palace was a fortress of gleaming metal, towering over the rest of the city. Inside, it was a labyrinth of corridors, halls, and chambers, each one more extravagant than the last. Ethan had seen it all in the reports, but seeing it in person was something else entirely. The colors, the scents, even the air felt different. And yet it was here, amidst all the alien splendor, that Ethan felt a strange sense of isolation. The conversations he had were polite but distant. No one really understood him, and he certainly didn't understand anyone here. It was a constant reminder that he was an outsider. His role wasn't to interact with the Queen directly. No, his task was to build rapport with her aides and the staff who helped her run the empire. They would be the ones to sway her decisions, Ethan had been told. And that's where he met Lyra. Lyra was the Queen's nanny. She wasn't the kind of nanny one might expect. She didn't have the warm, motherly vibe that Ethan had imagined. Lyra was reserved, sharp-eyed, and carried herself with an air of authority that put even the highest-ranking officials to shame. At first glance, she seemed like any other servant, but Ethan had learned quickly that appearances were deceiving. She had been assigned to watch over the Queen's young heir, a child whose future was entwined with the fate of the galaxy. The heir was still young, barely old enough to speak in full sentences, but there was something extraordinary about them. Ethan had seen it in the child's eyes, the weight of destiny. He had met Lyra several times in passing during brief meetings in the Queen's court. She never paid him much attention, but Ethan couldn't help but notice the way she moved with purpose, the way she commanded respect without saying a word. There was something about her that intrigued him, something he couldn't quite place. Today, however, was different. Ethan had been summoned to the palace to discuss a new human initiative. The discussions were meant to be formal, but Ethan had learned from experience that sometimes the most important insights came from the less structured moments. It was during one of these informal discussions that his words slipped out. He had been speaking to a few of the Queen's aides about a potential trade agreement when he made a comment about how humans would handle the situation differently. The words had been meant as a light-hearted observation, but the moment they left his mouth, Ethan realized they might not have been the wisest choice. "You know," he had said, laughing nervously, "on Earth, we would have just asked the leaders to sit down and talk it out. No need for all this pomp and ceremony." The aides chuckled, but it was Lyra's reaction that caught him off guard. She had been standing in the background, as always, watching over the air. Her gaze flicked toward him for the briefest moment, and there was something in her eyes, an intensity that stopped him in his tracks. She didn't speak right away, but her silence was more telling than words. Ethan cleared his throat, suddenly feeling very self-conscious. "I'm sorry," he said, not sure why he felt the need to apologize. "It's just that on Earth we tend to be a bit more straightforward." Lyra stepped forward, her expression unreadable. "Straightforward," she said slowly, her voice carrying an unfamiliar weight, "is often the easiest way to make enemies." Ethan frowned, not expecting such a response. "I didn't mean it like that," he said, trying to recover his composure. "I was just—" "You were stating that humans handle problems with simplicity," Lyra interrupted. "But simplicity is often an illusion. Sometimes it's the complexity of an issue that requires true understanding." Her words hung in the air, heavy and thought-provoking. Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but for a moment he found himself at a loss. There was something about the way she spoke, so calm yet so firm, that made him feel like a child in front of a teacher. "You're right," he said after a pause. "I didn't mean to suggest anything offensive." Lyra's gaze softened ever so slightly, but she didn't smile. "It is not offense that I worry about, diplomat," she said, her tone becoming even more enigmatic. "It is what you do not see that concerns me." Ethan didn't know what to make of that. He had always thought of himself as perceptive, someone who understood the nuances of conversation and diplomacy. But Lyra's words had a weight to them that he couldn't ignore. What did she mean? What was it that he wasn't seeing? The conversation drifted into other matters, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Lyra was no ordinary nanny. There was a depth to her, a hidden knowledge that he had barely begun to scratch the surface of. That evening, after the meeting had concluded, Ethan found himself wandering the palace's long corridors. He wasn't sure why, but his thoughts kept returning to Lyra's words. What was she really saying? What was it that she saw in him, in humanity, that he didn't understand? As he turned a corner, he nearly collided with a servant carrying a tray of food. He quickly apologized and stepped aside, but his thoughts were still far from the moment. He walked through the halls with a sense of purpose, but the closer he got to the Queen's private chambers, the more he felt an undeniable pull to go in the opposite direction. The air grew heavier as he passed by several ornate doors, each one guarded by silent sentinels. He knew where he was going now, and even though he didn't fully understand why, his feet seemed to know the way. He ended up in the garden, the place where he had first seen Lyra. The garden was alive with alien plants, massive flowers that shimmered with bioluminescence, trees that stretched toward the sky like tendrils, and strange creatures that flitted about like glowing fireflies. The atmosphere was tranquil, yet there was an underlying sense of mystery, a feeling that the garden hid secrets. Ethan stood by a fountain, staring down at the water as it flowed gently. His thoughts were still tangled in Lyra's cryptic words. What did she mean by simplicity being an illusion? Was there something deeper at play here, something he wasn't seeing? The sound of footsteps interrupted his reverie. He turned to see Lyra walking toward him, her expression calm and composed. The air was nowhere in sight, but Ethan knew she would be nearby, always under Lyra's watchful eye. "You've come to the garden again," Lyra said, her voice carrying the same quiet authority it always did. "Do you seek clarity?" Ethan nodded, though he wasn't sure what exactly he was seeking. "I'm just thinking," he said. "I didn't expect your response earlier. You've given me a lot to think about." Lyra stopped a few feet away from him, her gaze softening. "Sometimes the answers are found not in what is said, but in what is left unsaid," she said. "What you don't know can shape the future in ways you cannot yet imagine." Her words struck him like a thunderclap, but before he could respond, she turned and began to walk away. Ethan watched her leave, his mind racing. There was so much more to Lyra than he had ever imagined. And as he stood in the garden, he couldn't help but feel that his journey here, his mission, was about to take a turn he hadn't anticipated. The next few days passed by in a blur for Ethan. The heavy weight of his duties as a diplomat kept him occupied, but his thoughts were often elsewhere. Lyra's words echoed in his mind, haunting him in the quiet moments between meetings and negotiations. She had said that simplicity was an illusion, and that what he didn't see was more important than what he did. Those words lingered in the air like an unsolved puzzle, and Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something crucial. He had tried to focus on his work, but it was hard to ignore the nagging sensation that there was something deeper at play. As days turned into weeks, Ethan found himself drawn back to the palace garden, the place where he had first met Lyra. It was there that he could find some peace, away from the bustle of political matters. The garden had become his refuge, a place to clear his mind. He didn't know what it was about the place, perhaps the strange plants or the tranquil atmosphere, but it felt like the only spot in the entire palace where he could think clearly. Each time he visited, he found himself watching the way the light shifted across the water, the way the alien flowers glowed softly under the moonlight, and the way the wind whispered through the leaves. It was as if the garden itself held secrets, waiting for someone to uncover them. It was on one of these quiet evenings that Lyra appeared again. She was walking through the garden, her eyes focused on the path ahead. The heir, the young child of the queen, was nowhere to be seen, but Ethan knew that Lyra would never be far from the child's side. The heir's safety was her responsibility, and she took it seriously. Ethan stood up from the stone bench where he had been sitting, his heart racing slightly as he approached her. There was something different about her today, Her usual calm and composed demeanor was tinged with something else, something Ethan couldn't quite place. It was as though she was carrying a heavy burden, one that she couldn't fully hide. She stopped when she noticed him, her expression unreadable as always. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with unspoken thoughts and questions. Ethan didn't know what to say, but he had to ask. "I've been thinking about what you said," he said quietly, not wanting to break the fragile silence that hung between them. Lyra nodded but didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence was an invitation for him to continue. "What did you mean?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "About simplicity being an illusion, and about what I don't see." Lyra's gaze softened, and for the first time she didn't look as distant as she usually did. It was as though she was considering whether or not to reveal something she hadn't shared with anyone before. "There are many things in this universe that are not as they seem," she began, her voice steady but tinged with an emotion Ethan couldn't quite read. "You, like many humans, see the surface of things. You take what you're given and you accept it without questioning what lies beneath." Ethan frowned, trying to understand. "Are you saying that I'm blind to something, that I don't see the bigger picture?" Lyra's lips twitched, almost as though she was about to smile, but she stopped herself. "Not blind," she said, her tone thoughtful, "but perhaps unaware. You live in a world where everything is concrete, where facts are what you see. Here in this galaxy, things are different. Things are often hidden, and it's those hidden things that shape the course of history." Ethan felt a wave of frustration rise within him. "I don't understand. What hidden things? What are you trying to tell me?" Lyra took a deep breath and looked up at the stars, her gaze distant as if she was searching for something beyond the garden. "You are here for a reason, Ethan," she said quietly. "You and the humans, you are part of a much larger story. The Queen's empire may appear to be at the center of it all, but the truth is far more complicated." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? Is there something about Earth that I do know, something the Queen hasn't told me?" Lyra hesitated, then turned back to him, her eyes locking onto his. "There are things the Queen has kept hidden, even from her own people. There are factions within her court that have been working against her, and there are truths that have been buried for centuries. You, Ethan, are tied to these truths in a way that you cannot yet comprehend." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. "You're saying that Earth is involved in something bigger than just diplomacy, something more dangerous?" Lyra nodded slowly. "Yes." "And the Queen's heir?" She paused, as though weighing her words carefully. "The heir is at the heart of it all. The child is not just a symbol of the future of this empire. The heir holds the key to something that could change the fate of the entire galaxy." Ethan's mind was reeling. He had heard rumors of the heir's potential, of the child's extraordinary abilities, but he had never imagined that the child's fate was tied to something so much larger, something that could affect the entire galaxy. "Why are you telling me this?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why now?" Lyra's expression hardened, the faint warmth she had shown earlier fading. "Because you need to understand what's at stake. The Queen has her plans, but not all of them are in humanity's best interest. There are forces at play here that could tear everything apart." Ethan's heart raced. He had been walking into this situation blindly, thinking that his role was simple, that he was here to make deals and build alliances. But now he realized how wrong he had been. There was something far more complex happening beneath the surface, and he had no idea what role he played in it. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of thoughts in his mind. Lyra studied him for a long moment before speaking. "You must learn what is hidden, Ethan. You must uncover the truths that the Queen and her court have kept from the galaxy. Only then will you understand what is truly at stake." Ethan felt a sudden surge of determination. He didn't know what exactly he was getting into, but he knew one thing: he couldn't ignore this. He couldn't turn away from the mystery Lyra had just opened up before him. The fate of Earth and the galaxy depended on it. Lyra turned and began walking away, her steps slow and deliberate. As she reached the edge of the garden, she paused and looked back at him. "You'll find the answers where you least expect them," she said cryptically. "But be careful, Ethan. There are many who would see you fail." And with that, she disappeared into the shadows, leaving Ethan standing in the moonlit garden, his mind racing with questions and revelations. The answers were out there, he knew. And somehow he had to find them before it was too late. Ethan spent the following days consumed by thoughts of what Lyra had said. The weight of her words hung over him like a thick fog. The deeper he thought about it, the more he realized how little he truly understood about the situation he had found himself in. He was supposed to be a simple human liaison between Earth and the alien empire, but now he was entangled in something much bigger, something he couldn't escape even if he wanted to. The Queen's court had become a maze of intrigue, with every conversation and every gesture seeming to hold hidden meanings. Ethan's official duties felt insignificant compared to the mystery he now found himself part of. He had come to this palace believing he could handle the political side of things, but now nothing seemed as straightforward as it had before. The heir, the child at the center of all the whispers, remained a mystery. Ethan had seen the child only a handful of times, mostly during formal events or in passing. The heir was quiet, almost too quiet for someone of their age. There was something unusual about them, something that set them apart from the other beings in the palace. Ethan had tried to learn more, but the Queen's advisors were always tight-lipped when it came to discussing the child. It seemed like the more questions he asked, the more answers eluded him. It was late one evening when Ethan received a summons to the Queen's private chambers. He had been expecting the call for days, but now that it had arrived, his heart raced with uncertainty. The Queen's meetings were rarely social, and he knew this one wouldn't be either. He had no idea what the Queen wanted with him, but he suspected that his involvement in her plans had just taken another step. When he entered the chamber, he was greeted by the Queen's personal attendants, who led him to the grand room where the Queen herself awaited. The room was lavish as expected, with walls made of polished stone that shimmered in the low light. The Queen sat at the far end, her posture regal and unyielding. Her alien features were beautiful and intimidating, her sharp eyes gleaming with hidden thoughts. She motioned for him to sit, and he obeyed, taking a seat across from her. "You've been asking questions," the Queen said, her voice smooth and commanding. "About my heir, about the future of this empire." Ethan didn't speak immediately, unsure of how to respond. The Queen had never been one to hide her intentions. There was no use pretending he hadn't been curious, but now that he was here, he wasn't sure if he was ready for the truth. "I've learned a few things," Ethan finally said, keeping his voice steady. "There's more to this situation than I initially thought. I'm trying to understand my place in all of this." The Queen studied him carefully, her gaze unwavering. "Your place," she repeated. "You are here to represent Earth. That is your purpose, Ethan, nothing more." Ethan's heart sank at her words. Was this all he would ever be? A simple representative, a pawn in a much larger game. He wanted to ask her about the heir, about the truths that Lyra had hinted at, but he held his tongue. The Queen wasn't someone you could approach with questions about things she wanted to keep secret. The silence stretched between them until the Queen finally spoke again. "Lyra has told you things, hasn't she?" The Queen's tone was laced with something darker now, a hint of annoyance beneath the surface. "You've been prying into matters that don't concern you." Ethan's stomach tightened. It was clear that the Queen didn't trust him, not fully. But it wasn't just distrust. There was something else in her eyes, something colder, as if she saw him as an obstacle to be managed. "I haven't meant to cause trouble," Ethan said cautiously. "I'm just trying to understand what's going on. Earth, my people, they're in the dark about all of this. If I don't know what's really happening, how can I help?" The Queen's expression softened for just a moment, but it was fleeting. "It's not your job to help," she said sharply. "It's your job to follow orders." Ethan felt a surge of frustration. He had expected this, expected her to maintain control and not give him anything useful, but it still stung. This wasn't just about his mission anymore. It was about something much larger, something that involved both Earth and the galaxy. "The heir," Ethan blurted out, unable to hold it in any longer. "What's the truth about the heir? There's more to this child, isn't there? Lyra has told me things and I don't understand. What is it that you're hiding?" The Queen's eyes flashed with anger, her voice rising with an intensity that caught Ethan off guard. "You think you have a right to know?" she demanded. "You are a diplomat, not a ruler. You do not understand what is at stake here, Ethan. The heir's destiny is tied to the future of the galaxy, and it is not something I take lightly. There are forces at work that even I cannot control, but I will do everything in my power to protect my child." Ethan swallowed, feeling the weight of her words. He had been expecting resistance, but not this level of emotion. He had no idea what the Queen's child represented, but it was clear now that the child's future was tied to something far beyond the palace walls. "Then let me help," Ethan said quietly, his voice steady. I don't want to be a pawn in a game. I want to be a partner. I want to protect Earth. The queen stared at him for a long moment, and for the first time he saw a flicker of something akin to respect in her eyes. You cannot protect what you do not understand, she said, her voice softer now. But perhaps you can be useful. There are those who wish to see the air fall. You have seen what is at stake, haven't you? The factions that work in the shadows, pulling the strings. They will stop at nothing to bring down my family and take control of the galaxy. And you, Ethan, are caught in the middle of it. Ethan's mind raced. Factions, enemies, what had he stumbled into? All he had wanted was to help Earth, but now it seemed that his mission was about to take a darker turn. The queen leaned forward, her gaze fixed on him with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. You must choose a side, she said, her voice low and commanding. I will not allow my heir to fall into the hands of those who would use them for their own gain. You must decide if you will stand with me, or if you will stand against me. Ethan felt his heart pounding in his chest. The queen had just placed him in the middle of a war he hadn't known existed, a war that could change the course of history. There was no turning back now. I will stand with you, he said, his voice firm. I don't know everything yet, but I will protect the heir. I will protect Earth. The queen's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. Good, then prepare yourself, Ethan. The war is coming and you will need to be ready. As Ethan left the queen's chambers, his mind was spinning with everything he had just learned. The stakes were higher than he could have imagined, and the truth about the heir was far more complicated than he had ever thought. He had been chosen for a reason. His involvement in this conflict wasn't a coincidence, but he had no idea how deep the rabbit hole went. He found himself walking back through the palace, his thoughts racing. Lyra's warnings, the queen's secrets, the fate of the heir, it was all connected in ways he didn't fully understand. But one thing was clear. His life and the future of Earth were now bound to this galactic struggle. There was no turning back. The path ahead would be dangerous, but Ethan knew one thing for certain. He was in this for the long haul. He had made his choice. And now he would fight for Earth, for the heir, and for whatever it was that the future held.